I don't know how much good it's going to do, but at least I'm turned on finally. I know it's hot and humid and you're tired, but I got all dressed up to come and do this, so I'm going to do it anyway. This morning's sermon is not a normal sermon. Now, you're not terribly surprised about that either, are you? Randy certainly is not. I'm going to give you the upshot of the sermon at the beginning, the conclusion at the beginning. And then I want to share a meditation and 3 short stories, 2 of which were mine from my childhood. I wrote these down in this wording that I'm going to use today about almost 10 years ago. And the middle story is really from Anthony Campolo. Now, Tony Campolo is my favorite Baptist preacher. He's also a sociologist, a little older than I am, and I'm going to quote his story verbatim. That's one of the reasons I have all these papers in front of me, because it's too elegant for me to try to give it from memory. In a book published in 2009 by Clive Cussler, called Corsair, Clive Cussler poses the question, why do they hate us? Speaking of a specific enemy in that case, but enemies in general. And then gives this threefold answer. They hate us because we exist. They hate us because we are different from them. And most important, they hate us because they think they have a right to hate us. That's a good part of the dynamic that we are feeling in most of the world around us. If you watch the daily news, I get up, one of the first things I watch in the morning. Matter of fact, I turn it on at, 4 o'clock? 4 o'clock in the morning is early CBS News. I'm going to have to stop doing that. Because you feel the truth of all 3 of these. They hate us because we exist. They hate us because we are different from them. They hate us because they feel they have a right to hate us. And we feel that and feel that and feel that. Now, the upshot of today's sermon, I had not planned on preaching relating to what happened down in Charleston. That I find sort of overwhelming anyway, so I've stuck to my older text for the most part. But that church is special because those people have already indicated an alternative way to hate. This church is special because we here in this room, even this morning, show the potential of an alternative way of life to that of exclusion and hatred of anybody who's different. Do we always lift up to it? Well, close. But it's here. And the real issue of my sermon is to urge this congregation to continue to build on that as we face the future and to serve as one of those bright spots in a gloomy world right here in Cleveland, Ohio. For this area, for northeastern Ohio, and I would dare say for the entire state of Ohio. We need to find ways to share the secret of who we are. That's basically what I want to say in the sermon, but I'm going to spend a little bit more time getting to that. I'd like to share with you first a meditation that I wrote almost 10 years ago, and then have a prayer, and then 3 stories. So you sit back and relax. You already know the main point. About 6 years ago, I started writing out my faith journey, and I've entitled it A Quartet on Life. The first section of that writing is called The Early Years, Don't Ya Know. Now that inelegant word, don't ya, is the way that this little boy heard the phrase, don't you know, from those around him. So I'd like to share a meditation that I wrote from that perspective of that little boy that I have based on Genesis 4:10, which was read this morning. And the Lord said to Cain, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. my meditation. I'm kind of queer, don't you know? Too bad about little Jimmy, don't you know? Not much of a real boy, don't you know? Probably a sissy, don't you know? I will never be a real man, don't you know? I still seem a little queer, don't you know? I'm just awfully different, I guess. My brother is cute. I'm just in the way. I know that's true because I've heard it said. I wish I could disappear into a corner. Then I wouldn't be in the way anymore. I wish I was not so little, don't you know? I guess I don't count for much, don't you know? Maybe I'm disposable, a throwaway person. I wonder if Abel was little. I wonder if he was different and in the way. Nobody much seemed to really care about it. When his brother killed him, there was no word of rebuke or anguish from Adam and Eve. Didn't his parents miss him? Didn't they cry when he died? God alone noticed and cared. God said, Abel's life cried out from the ground, soaked with his blood. I will cry out too, don't you know? I invite you at this point to eavesdrop on my prayer as I share the stories. Dear Abba, Mama, Papa God, eternal and ever-present lover, you gently wiped away the tears from my cheeks when I cried. You caressed me when I felt ugly. You kissed me when I felt unlovable. How could I help but fall in love with you? Give me the courage now, dear Abba, to speak the words chosen for me to speak. Amen. First, my story. For a long time, I had assumed that mine was a relatively normal childhood. As I look back on it, however, with some distance in time and space, I hope to God that not all children underwent identical or similar experiences. In 1943, a lot of you weren't even born yet. No, you don't have to shake your head, yes. In 1943, my father was drafted into the Army for World War II. At that time, we had been living in a small rental home in Niles, Ohio. Putting most things in storage, my father drove my mother and my brother and myself to the home of my maternal grandparents over in Defiance, Ohio. You know where that is? It's west of you. I remember that though the trip itself seemed interminable, we finally arrived about mid-evening at their home. I also remember being very curious as to just how we found grandparents. Now, my mother I was 3 years old, remember. My mother tried to explain that they were her grandparents. I thought that was perfectly nice, but where on earth did we find them? The next morning after we arrived, my father boarded a train for Fort McClellan in Alabama. From there, he would eventually be shipped overseas. I, 3 years old, felt totally uprooted and abandoned. I can only assume that my daddy and I had a wonderful relationship before he was so abruptly removed from my life. At least that's what everyone said. As we settled into my grandparents' home, I was essentially not able to adjust. I became quite ill with spasms of vomiting and high temperatures. I cried myself to sleep on a nightly basis. My mother and grandmother quickly became very alarmed. I wasn't very big to begin with. I certainly didn't need to lose more weight. They took me to old Doc Wynn. Now, I think Doc was his first name and Wynn was his last name. Everybody in town just knew old Doc Wynn. who diagnosed my problem as a kind of homesickness for my father. He had caught on that I seemed to feel that my father had driven me over somewhere, abandoned me, and then went back home. And so the doctor suggested that perhaps taking me back to the house in Niles to show me that house was empty, he was not there, that might help. Otherwise, they would have to take me down to Fort McClellan and try to work backwards from there. The trip to Niles seemed to do the trick, at least with regard to overt physical symptoms. Now, this was the immediate background and the beginning of my hearing and overhearing phrases that included, "Don't you know?" as people discussed me with one another. As a 3-year-old, I was a little kid. I'm much bigger now, but still a little kid. My brother was cute at about 6 weeks of age when we moved to Defiance. I felt just in the way. I know I kept hearing those statements over and over again. I just did not fit the descriptions of a normal little boy to the people of that area and that time. As I started to get a little older, I developed a strong love for music, and again, signs of an artistic and perhaps even poetic personality were emerging. I kept hearing phrases like, "He's kind of queer, don't you know? He's son of a sissy, don't you know?" All this rang in the ears of a little boy who already felt frightened by being uprooted from all that was familiar and from losing his daddy to the demands of warfare. All of these comments and people's sad looks increased the insecurities of that little boy who felt just too different to fit in with normal people. To make matters worse, I was intensely interested in my grandmother's cooking. Little boys wouldn't be interested in cooking, right? I was intensely interested in cooking. I loved to be with her, quote, helping, unquote, as she made pies and cookies. Even more disturbing to family was the fact that my favorite relative was a great aunt who lived in Toledo. I loved to go to her place for long visits. She treated me like a real person. But her own lifestyle evoked suspicion in the rest of the family. She never married and had a very good female friend and traveling companion. Besides that, she was Seventh-day Adventist, which everyone in that family knew was a strange religion. At least they thought so. It was often surmised that she and her friend slept together. I think they figured that she too was kind of queer, don't you know? As I continued to internalize their comments and looks with great pain, I came to the conclusion that I was not and never could be a normal little boy. Somehow, I was different from everyone else. I increased in shyness with a desperate desire to be accepted. I suffered great damage to my own self-understanding and was very much diminished in my own eyes. Deep in my heart, I saw myself as a throwaway person. As did Abel, I too shall cry out to God. Anthony Campolo tells us the story of a fellow student from his high school days. And I quote him directly here. Roger was gay. We all knew it, and we all made his life miserable. When we passed him in the hall, we would call out his name in an effeminate manner. We made gestures, and we made Roger the brunt of very cheap jokes. He never took showers with us after gym class because he knew we'd whip him with our wet towels. I wasn't there the day some of the guys dragged Roger into the shower room and shoved him into the corner. Curled up on the floor, he cried and begged for mercy as 5 guys urinated all over him. The report said that Roger went to bed that night as usual, and that sometime around 2 o'clock in the morning he got up, went down to the basement of his house, and he hanged himself. When I heard about Roger, I realized that I was not a Christian. Now remember, I told you he's my favorite Baptist preacher. I was theologically sound evangelical, believed all the points of the Apostles' Creed, and had declared Jesus to be my Lord and Savior. But I know now that if the Holy Spirit had really been in me, I would have stood up for Roger. When the guys came to make fun of him, I would have put one arm around Roger's shoulder and waved the guys off with the other and told them to leave him alone and not mess with him because he was my friend. But I was afraid to be Roger's friend. I knew that if I stood up for a homosexual, people would say cruel things about me too. So I kept my distance. If I had done better, who knows if Roger might be alive today. My third and final story is again from my childhood. When we moved back to the city of Youngstown in the mid-40s, we settled into an area called Smoky Hollow, an old and relatively poor group of neighborhoods. It got its name from the fact that great quantities of soot fell and covered this somewhat bowl-shaped area near the steel mills. There were 3 basic neighborhoods in Smoky Hollow. 2 of them enjoyed a mixture and generally amicable configuration of first and second generation Italians and largely Eastern European Jews, mostly Orthodox. During those years, the black population was expected to stay pretty much in its own neighborhood within the larger area of Smoky Hollow. We're talking about the mid-40s here, folks. I'd love to say that everything's changed. I can't do that. I had the one place that sort of didn't fall into that strict segregation was the elementary school, which was just outside of Smoky Hollow. I had a schoolmate friend, David, who was a black person, lived in that area of Smoky Hollow. I could walk over to his apartment and join him in our trek to school. Coming home, I could walk back with him to his apartment, but he could never walk with me to mine. I could play in his neighborhood, but he could never play in mine. That made no sense to this little boy at all. But somehow David seemed to understand this, even if I did not. As a matter of fact, I would get mad at him. I would get quite angry with him for his refusal to come over to my house and play. I always went to his place, but I never thought any of that was fair. What did I know? I've since quipped that I might have been the only white Protestant kid in all of Smoky Hollow. Some of the greater divisions were along religious lines. You were either Catholic, Jewish, or Black Baptist. As a disciple, I fit in with the Black Baptist much better than I did with the Catholic or Jewish at that point in my life. I always had, my Catholic playmates, and I did have a few, always were convinced, they had this notion that I was going straight to hell. I never understood that, but I kind of resented it, don't you know? There was another thing, I never did understand their talk about mortal and venial sins. You know, that just never made any sense to me. So David became probably my closest buddy. But one time, possibly the event with the greatest single impact on my life in Smoky Hollow happened when I was about 7 years old. Behind our backyard on North Walnut Street was a small and vacant lot or field. This lot was littered with pieces of trash. One such item I remember was an old, rusty set of bed springs. One day, about mid-afternoon, some of us were playing out in the street out front. Well, we always played in the street. It's the only place to play. Playing in the street out front when we heard what sounded like a gunshot, and it sounded so awfully close. We ran in the direction from which that sound had come, and I found myself back at the edge of our backyard, abutting that field, and I noticed that a neighborhood crowd was forming. Then the horrible scene caught my eye. Lying just in front of those rusty bed springs was the body of a young black man face down in the dirt of that lot. I remember vividly that he had no shoes on. He was barefoot and he was shirtless. But I was awestruck by his appearance. I was captivated by the absolute beauty of what I saw as that chocolate, velvety brown skin of his back. Flawless. It seemed to be the most beautiful thing I ever saw. He was probably in his late teens and very muscular. I have described that back as flawless, but that's not quite true. In the upper third of his back, between his shoulder blades, that velvety chocolate brown skin had been brutally violated, and there was the hole of a bullet. Blood was still running from that hole and seeping into the ground. As a 7-year-old, that struck me as the most awful thing I had ever seen. Someone shouted that we should call the police, and a murmur started. Just then, however, a voice broke through all of the other voices of the growing crowd. "What's all the fuss about?" a man shouted. "It's just a dam." Anyway. To my horror, that mostly white crowd responded with enthusiastic agreement. I felt as though I would explode. How could it be possible for anyone to be just a damned anything? This was a beautiful young brown man. How does this happen? At bedtime that night, this scene continued to haunt me, and those words continued to haunt me, and I could not settle down and go to sleep. My parents tried to reassure me. They told me not to be afraid. I was safe, they told me. Yes, I was afraid, and I felt anything but safe. But what they didn't even understand was that my fear was also for David, my friend. After all, he was about the same shade of chocolate brown as the man who had been murdered. The truth is, that scene still haunts me almost 70 years later. And it does not lose its power to horrify me and make an impact on my life. I scream from deep within my soul, nobody is ever just a damned anything! All people are children of God. If we really believe that we are created in God's image, it is inconceivable that we should ever dismiss any other person simply because that other person is different from ourselves. This beautiful, velvety chocolate brown young man was treated as a throwaway person. His blood, too, cries out to God from the ground. Beloved, let the world know that God has created no throwaway